The city of Athens lay heavy with silence, a silence not born of peace but of exhaustion. The Peloponnesian War had ended only a few years before, and though Sparta had withdrawn, the scars remained. Athens, once the proud jewel of democracy and reason, now staggered like an aging warrior, bloodied and insecure. Its streets still bustled with merchants and children, yet behind every corner lingered suspicion, fear, and a fragile sense of order. In the heart of this uncertain city lived a man who seemed to belong to no one and yet belonged to all: Socrates. He was unlike any figure Athens had ever seen. While others dressed in fine robes, he wandered barefoot, his cloak threadbare, his beard unkempt. He owned nothing of wealth, no gold, no home filled with luxuries, yet his presence carried an aura that made generals uneasy and politicians wary. For Socrates wielded no sword, but words that cut deeper than steel. He would stop strangers in the marketplace, soldiers, poets, even the proud statesmen of Athens, and with simple questions, strip away their pretenses. What is justice? He would ask. What is virtue? What is the good life? His questions, relentless and sharp, dismantled the certainties of men who believed themselves wise. It was said that speaking with Socrates was like wrestling with a skilled fighter. You always left exhausted, and often humiliated. To the young, however, he was a revelation. They followed him through the agora, listening, debating, laughing as he dismantled the pompous claims of elders. They were drawn not by riches or power, but by the possibility that truth itself could be pursued, naked and fearless. Among them were men whose names would echo through history: Plato, Xenophon, Alcibiades. To them, Socrates was not merely a teacher. He was a force of nature, a gadfly that stung Athens awake. But to the city's rulers, he was a threat. A wounded democracy, still reeling from war and tyranny, could not tolerate a man who encouraged its youth to question authority, to challenge tradition, to strip bare the illusions of the powerful. Whispers began to spread. He corrupts the youth. He denies the gods. He undermines the order of the polis. What was philosophy to his followers became dangerous subversion to his enemies, yet Socrates walked unafraid. He mocked the fear of death, claiming that to live without truth was far worse. He angered generals by exposing their ignorance of strategy, embarrassed politicians by revealing their shallow grasp of justice. Even in the assembly, where Athens prided itself on free speech, his voice cut like a blade in a room filled with fragile egos. The irony was sharp. Athens, the birthplace of democracy and philosophy, was now preparing to silence its greatest philosopher. The people who once celebrated open debate now yearned for certainty, for stability, for someone to blame. And there stood Socrates, barefoot, unyielding, refusing to flatter or bow. It was only a matter of time before the accusation came. Corrupting the youth, impiety, crimes against the city, words sharpened into daggers, and soon the old philosopher found himself not in the marketplace, surrounded by eager students, but in the courtroom, staring into the eyes of hundreds of jurors, men who would decide his fate. The stage was set. Athens demanded submission. Socrates, as always, demanded truth. And in that collision of power and principle, history would witness one of the most extraordinary trials the world has ever known. The agora, once filled with laughter at Socrates' clever banter, had grown colder. Where once his questions sparked curiosity, now they stirred unease. Many whispered as he passed, muttering that this ragged old man had poisoned the youth of Athens with dangerous ideas. The war had left the city desperate for unity, and Socrates, with his endless probing, seemed like an open wound that refused to heal. The seeds of conflict had been planted years earlier. Socrates' relentless dialogues had embarrassed too many men in power. He had mocked generals during wartime, exposed poets who pretended to know the nature of beauty, and torn apart politicians who claimed wisdom but spoke only in riddles of ambition. Athens could forgive defeat at the hands of Sparta, but it could not forgive humiliation at the hands of a barefoot philosopher. The charges began as whispers, accusations floating like smoke over the city. He denies the gods, some said, recalling his mocking of myths. He introduces strange new deities, others added, pointing to his talk of a mysterious guiding voice, his daimonion, that warned him against wrongdoing. But the most venomous charge was the claim that he corrupted the youth of Athens. Parents murmured of sons who once dreamed of military honor, now chasing ideas of justice and truth. The elders saw rebellion in their children's eyes, and they blamed Socrates. His enemies were not few, nor were they weak. Chief among them was Anytus, a wealthy politician who had watched his son fall under Socrates' spell. To him, Socrates was not merely eccentric, and he was dangerous, a corrosive influence gnawing at the roots of authority. Alongside Anytus stood Meletus, a fiery poet, and Lycon, a rhetorician. Together they formed a coalition of vengeance, determined to bring Athens' gadfly to trial. But what did Socrates do in the face of this rising tide? He did what he had always done, he questioned. When warned of the growing hostility, he laughed softly, saying, "Do you think a man who has spent his life in search of truth would abandon it now, out of fear of death?" To his followers, his courage was maddening, almost reckless. They begged him to soften his tone, to flatter the powerful, to at least appear pious. Socrates shook his head. "If I live by lies, I will already be dead." The city, meanwhile, remembered the recent tyranny of the 30, a brutal regime that had ruled Athens after the war. Several of Socrates' former students had been associated with them, Alcibiades and Critias among them. Though Socrates had never wielded a weapon or held power, guilt by association clung to him like a shadow. His critics did not need proof. Suspicion was enough. The wounds of tyranny were fresh, and the people wanted someone to blame. The formal charges came swiftly like a spear thrust in the dark. Meletus, standing in the assembly, accused Socrates publicly. Socrates is guilty of corrupting the youth and of impiety, of not believing in the gods of the city, but introducing strange new ones. The words echoed across Athens. To question the gods was no small crime. Religion bound the polis together. Impiety was seen as betrayal, not only of faith but of community itself. Socrates, however, refused to defend himself in the way others expected. When dragged before the assembly to respond, he did not beg nor weep nor flatter the jurors. Instead, he met the accusations with irony. "Meletus says I corrupt the youth," he said calmly. "And yet if I corrupt them, I do so unintentionally. For no man wishes to live among bad men. Tell me, Meletus, if I make men wicked, do I not also make my own life worse? And if unintentionally, then what I need is instruction, not punishment." He spoke not like a defendant, but like a teacher. He turned his trial into another dialogue, forcing his accusers to reveal their contradictions, exposing their ignorance. The jurors murmured uneasily. Some admired his courage. Others saw only arrogance. Outside the court, tension boiled. His followers, Plato among them, urged the people to see reason. But reason was fragile in a city scarred by war and tyranny. The mob did not want philosophy. It wanted blood. The conflict had crystallized into something larger than one man's fate. This was no longer about Socrates alone. It was about Athens itself, about whether a democracy born in the pursuit of free thought would tolerate a man who embodied that principle to its extreme. Would the city protect its gadfly, or crush him under the weight of its fear? In the shadow of the Acropolis, the people gathered. The air was thick with anger, confusion, and dread. Socrates, as always, stood calm. But the tide had turned, and he knew it. The trial was no longer merely possible. It was inevitable. And in that inevitability, the seeds of tragedy began to bloom. The trial of Socrates began under a bright Attic sun, its light glinting off the marble stones of the Heliaia, Athens' great people's court. Nearly 500 jurors sat waiting, ordinary citizens chosen by lot, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and contempt. The city buzzed with anticipation. Here was no common criminal, but the man who had dared to mock generals, poets, and politicians alike. Now Athens would decide his fate. Socrates entered not like a man trembling before his executioners, but like a teacher stepping into his classroom. He wore his usual simple cloak, walked barefoot across the dusty floor, and held his head high. To the crowd, his composure looked like defiance. To his students, Plato, Kreator, Apollodorus, it was nothing short of terrifying serenity. The accuser, Meletus, rose first. His voice was sharp, his words carefully chosen. "Athenians," he cried, "this man corrupts our sons, filling their minds with doubt and rebellion. He teaches them to despise our traditions, to question the gods of the city. If such poison spreads unchecked, Athens itself will fall. His words struck deep, for the memory of Sparta's victory still haunted the city. Fear was a powerful ally. Socrates listened in silence, a faint smile tugging at his lips. When it was his turn, he stood slowly and began in his calm, measured voice. Men of Athens, I do not know how my accusers have affected you. They are persuasive, though they spoke little truth. But I am not skilled in their rhetoric. I will speak as I always have, plainly and with honesty. His defense was unlike any the court had heard. He admitted freely that he was a gadfly, sent by the gods to sting the city into wakefulness. I know nothing, he confessed, except that I know nothing. And yet he declared that his mission, to question, to expose ignorance, to search for virtue, was divinely ordained. If you kill me, he warned, you will not easily find another like me. I am your gadfly, and without me this city may well fall into slumber. The jurors shifted uneasily. Some were moved, others bristled at his audacity. A defendant was supposed to plead, to humble himself, to appeal to pity. Socrates, instead, turned his defense into a sermon on philosophy. Anytus, the politician, could bear no more. Rising, he shouted, "This is no man of wisdom, but a corrupter and traitor." His words are poison, his arrogance insufferable. If Athens spares him, it declares itself the enemy of its own laws. His speech was met with cheers from the crowd. Still, Socrates did not yield. He pressed on, interrogating Meletus directly, leading him into contradictions before the eyes of the jury. "Tell me, Meletus," he asked, "who improves the youth of Athens?" Meletus stammered, "The laws." Socrates smiled thinly. "And who enforces those laws?" "The jurors." "So all Athenians improve the youth except me alone. Does that not sound strange?" The jurors murmured. Some chuckled, others glared. His logic was flawless, but his tone, sharp, ironic, and stung like a whip. Many felt mocked rather than enlightened. Outside the court, the tension was worse. Crowds gathered in the agora, gossip spilling like wildfire. Mothers cursed the philosopher, who had led their sons to scorn piety. Veterans muttered that Socrates' questions had weakened loyalty in the ranks. Merchants complained that Athens could not heal with such men stirring unrest. Yet among his disciples, the fire only burned brighter. Plato, scribbling furiously, recorded every word. Xenophon, though away on campaign, would later immortalize his teacher's defense. They saw in Socrates not a criminal, but a martyr for truth. The trial stretched long into the day. By the time the jurors cast their pebbles, the air was thick with dread. When the tally was read, Socrates had been found guilty by a narrow margin. The verdict sent a ripple through the court. His students gasped. His enemies smirked, but the drama was far from over. According to Athenian custom, both accuser and defendant could propose punishments, and the jury would decide between them. Meletus demanded death. All eyes turned to Socrates, expecting him to beg for exile or at least a fine. Instead, he smiled calmly and said, "What punishment do I deserve? For a lifetime spent improving you, for seeking truth, for asking you to care for your souls. If I must propose a penalty, then I propose this, that I be fed at the public's expense like the Olympic victors." Gasps filled the chamber. Some jurors laughed in disbelief, others boiled with rage. Socrates, standing unflinching, continued, "Yet if you think that too much, then I will accept a fine. My friends here will pay it." Plato and Kreator leapt to their feet, pledging silver on his behalf. But the damage was done. The jurors saw only insolence, arrogance, provocation. They had been given a chance to show mercy, but Socrates had dared to mock them instead. The second vote was cast. This time the margin was wider. The sentence was death. A hush fell over the court. Some jurors avoided his gaze. Others smiled grimly. His students wept openly. Socrates himself stood calm, serene, as if he had known this end all along. "The hour of departure has come," he said softly, almost to himself. "We go our ways, I to die and you to live. Which of us goes to the better lot? No one knows but the gods." The trial was over. The rising tide of conflict had broken into a flood. Athens had spoken. The gadfly must die. And with that decision, the city sealed not only the fate of one man, but the legacy of its own democracy. The stone walls of the Athenian prison were damp, their silence broken only by the distant echo of footsteps. Within one of its shadowed chambers, Socrates sat on a rough bench, shackles binding his ankles loosely. A flickering oil lamp threw shifting light across his lined face. Outside, the city carried on as usual. Merchants cried their wares. Children laughed in the streets. But within these walls, the philosopher prepared for death. His students came in hushed procession, their eyes heavy with grief. Plato, young and grave, carried a wax tablet under his arm, ready to record every word. Kreator, older and desperate, clutched at his master's hand. Apollodorus burst into tears the moment he crossed the threshold, sobbing so loudly the guards rolled their eyes. Kreator leaned close. "Socrates," he whispered, "there is still time. I have arranged everything. The guard is bribed, a ship waits in the harbor. We can spirit you away to Thessaly before the dawn. You need not die here, not like this." Socrates regarded him with kindness, then slowly shook his head. "My dear Kreator," he said, his voice calm as still water, "if I flee, what lesson do I leave behind? That laws matter only until they threaten us. That justice may be abandoned when inconvenient. No, to escape would be to betray myself and all that I have taught you. But the sentence is unjust." Kreator pleaded. "The city is blind, swayed by envy and fear. Surely injustice need not be obeyed." Socrates placed a hand on his student's shoulder. "And yet if we who claim to love justice undermine the law when it displeases us, what foundation remains for the city? If I destroy the law to save my life, then Athens is truly lost." The cell fell quiet. Even Apollodorus stifled his weeping for a moment, struck by the serenity in his teacher's words. The day passed with solemn conversation. Socrates spoke not of despair but of philosophy. He discussed the immortality of the soul, the nature of virtue, the duty of man to pursue wisdom above all else. Plato wrote in silence, his stylus scratching furiously across the tablet. Each phrase, each image would echo down the centuries. As evening deepened, the guard entered. He was an ordinary man, but his eyes betrayed a hint of sorrow. In his hand he carried a small clay cup. Within it sloshed a dark liquid, the juice of hemlock. The moment froze. Apollodorus wailed anew. Kreator covered his face. Even the guard averted his gaze, but Socrates reached for the cup without hesitation. "My friends," he said softly, "do not grieve. Rather rejoice that I depart without hatred in my heart. Remember, death is either a dreamless sleep or a passage to another place. If it is sleep, then it is rest. If it is passage, then I go to meet those who have gone before. Either way, no evil can befall a good man." He raised the cup to his lips. His hand did not tremble. He drank deeply, draining it in a single steady motion. For a moment, silence held the room. Then he placed the empty vessel down upon the stone floor. "It is time," he said quietly. He lay back upon the bench, his breathing steady, his expression untroubled. The poison began its work. His legs grew heavy. He shifted them slightly, then murmured, "When it reaches my heart, it will be over." Kreator clutched his hand. "Is there anything you wish to say, master? Any final request?" Socrates managed a faint smile. "Yes, Kreator, we owe a cock to Asclepius. See that it is paid." The words puzzled them. Why speak of a sacrifice to the god of healing at such a moment? But to Socrates, death was no curse. It was a cure, a liberation from the sickness of mortal life. The poison crept upward, numbing his body. His breath grew shallow. His students wept openly now, tears falling onto the stone. The guard turned away, unwilling to watch. Socrates closed his eyes. His chest rose once, twice, and then stilled. The philosopher who had taught Athens to question everything, who had stood unyielding before judges and mobs, who had chosen death over dishonor, was gone. The silence that followed was unbearable. Plato sat frozen, staring at his master's still face. Kreator wept silently, pressing the cold hand in his own. Apollodorus collapsed in sobs, his body racked with grief. Yet even in death, Socrates seemed to radiate peace. His lips held the ghost of a smile, as though he had slipped into the very truth he had sought all his life. News of his passing spread swiftly through Athens. Some scoffed that the city was rid of a nuisance. Others secretly felt a pang of shame. But his students carried the memory of that night like a sacred flame. They would write, they would teach, they would ensure that Socrates, though silenced, would never be forgotten. And indeed, he was not. From that prison cell, from that cup of hemlock, a legacy was born that outlived empires. The chamber where Socrates died remained silent long after his final breath. His students lingered, as if by staying in that place they could hold on to him a little longer. Outside, the night air hung heavy over Athens, a city unaware that it had extinguished one of its brightest flames. Plato sat apart, his wax tablet on his knees, recording the last words and movements of his master. To him, the death of Socrates was not an end, but the beginning of philosophy as a living, breathing path, not just theories in scrolls, but a way of life worth dying for. Kreator left the prison with his head bowed low, already thinking of the duty Socrates had given him to offer a cock to Asclepius. The instruction puzzled many, but to Kreator it was a final reminder that his teacher saw death not as tragedy, but as healing. In the days that followed, Athens returned to its rhythms. Merchants shouted their wares in the agora, children ran through the dusty alleys, and the courts judged new cases. Yet among the citizens there was an unease, an unspoken awareness that something profound had been lost. Some whispered that the city had acted rashly, killing a man whose only crime was to ask too many questions. Others hardened themselves, insisting it was necessary to preserve order. But Socrates' students refused to let his memory fade. They carried his words beyond Athens, scattering like seeds on foreign soil. Plato built an academy where philosophy flourished for centuries. Xenophon wrote his own recollections, preserving the image of a man who remained unshaken in the face of death. Through them, the gadfly's sting lived on, sharper than ever. The trial that had silenced one man gave voice to generations. The dialogues of Socrates became the foundation of Western philosophy. His method of questioning, relentless, uncomfortable, liberating, became a beacon for all who sought truth in the face of authority. His life became proof that even in defeat, integrity can achieve victory. For what was Socrates' true triumph? It was not found in persuading the jury, nor in escaping his sentence. His victory lay in showing that courage means holding fast to one's principles, even when the world demands compromise. That wisdom is not in claiming to know everything, but in admitting ignorance and striving always to learn. That death itself cannot defeat a man who has lived in pursuit of virtue. His story endures because it is not only about Athens, but about us. Every society faces the temptation to silence voices that question, to crush the uncomfortable truths that sting. Every age produces its gadflies, and every age must decide whether to heed them or to kill them. Socrates chose to drink the poison rather than betray his mission. In doing so, he left us a choice: to live unexamined lives, safe but shallow, or to risk discomfort in the pursuit of truth. Centuries later, his words still echo. The unexamined life is not worth living. It is a warning, but also a gift. To live examined is to live awake, to embrace doubt, to seek wisdom, and to refuse to settle for mere habit or blind obedience. Socrates died in a prison cell, condemned by his city, but he lives wherever questions are asked, wherever truth is sought, wherever courage stands against fear, and so his death was not defeat but transformation. From that cup of hemlock, a legacy flowed that no poison could kill.